Thank you all for coming today. My name is Dr. Crystal Collier. I'm a therapist, a researcher, and an author. I also work here as a fellow for the Hope and Healing Center. And my private practice is right over on Memorial and Westcott. I'm pretty close to here. So I've been studying this particular topic, we were just talking about this, for quite a few decades now. And it's been a really cool journey into learning this information, because when I started learning about this, they were just starting to figure out where in the body addiction occurs. And so since then, we've learned a lot about neurodevelopmental effects of substances on the brain. And what I want to teach you guys today is what I've learned about the neurodevelopmental and genetic effects of addiction on the brain, and then how that shows up interpersonally in our family life, and then specifically the effects that it has on children. And then I'll take questions toward the end. So as a therapist, I get asked this question quite a lot. Is it really so harmful? So let's see if you guys can guess. Who do you think asks me this the most? Parents or students? Everybody. Adults usually say that. Oh, it's the kids that ask that. And it's actually parents. Parents will come in to me after their kids kind of gotten in trouble for high-risk behavior, and they'll say, is it so bad? I mean, I drank in high school, I'm fine. I smoked a little weed when I was in college, and I'm okay. My child tells me it's a medicine. Don't believe your child when they say that. But, so here's how I answer this question. 90% of adult addicts began engaging in that substance use or that addictive behavior when they were a teenager. We actually know that the younger that you start, the increased risk that you have for struggling with an addiction. So I remember when I was looking at this chart about a decade ago, and I thought, this is amazing, because the risk that you run from starting younger deteriorates as long as you delay substance use. And if you actually delay substance use until you're 21 or older, you can completely, almost ameliorate your risk of struggling with any kind of addiction as an adult. So this tells us where our prevention dollars, I think, should be, right? Is in our high schools and our middle schools, definitely. So the reason why for such a beautiful slope like this has to do with what's going on in the brain during this stage of development. So I learned some things about brain development. I'm going to give you just a little primer on that. So I learned that there are really two major phases of brain development, starting with birth to about age 11, 12. Phase 1 consists of growing about 200 billion neurons. We get this big fluffy brain full of brain cells. Then we hit phase 2 of brain development that starts at about 11, 12, goes all the way till we're 24, 25, when we actually end up with 100 billion neurons left over. I promise you guys it's not all the high-risk behavior that we engage in that causes us to lose cells. It's really a normal, natural phase called pruning. So we actually prune away half of our neurons to make room for two substances. The first one is myelin. So this is a picture of a neuron, a brain cell, huge picture. And you can see that we have this fatty tissue called the myelin sheath that covers our axons. What I learned about myelin is that the thicker it is, the faster it conducts the electrical activity down the cell. And so this starts to thicken at around age 11, 12. The faster thinker you are, the faster processing speed you have. That's the scientific name for thinking speed, is processing speed. I learned that processing speed peaks at the age of 25. And for all of you guys that are above 25, you know it's kind of slowly downhill from there after that. Our processing speed starts slowing down. So we want our kids' processing speed to peak where it should peak. Now the second thing that's growing are these things right here that reach out to other cells known as dendrites. Now dendrites, interestingly enough, are the hardware of learning. Every time that you learn something new or practice something to create a habit, you actually grow new dendrites that reach out to other cells and make long pathways of cellular connections for those particular skills. So the longer strings that you have, the better. So this is a picture of an infant neuron, little baby neuron, and as it grows and develops over the next 18 months, you can see the thickening process and those dendrites growing and reaching out. This is what we want to see. We want to see really long strings of complicated connections for the skills that our brain does. And so this is an outside view of what it looks like. This is a study that was published in 1999. Professor Jay Geed started taking functional MRI pictures of adolescents as they grew and developed over time. And this particular study shows a compilation of a group of healthy adolescents that have no psychiatric or substance use diagnosis at all. And you can see that as the brain grows and develops over time, that there is a particular part of the brain that actually is growing and developing independent of the others. And that's right there behind the forehead, about halfway up the skull, known as the frontal lobes or prefrontal cortex. When we're young, we have a frontal lobe. It's just immature, underdeveloped, which is cool because we rely on our parents' frontal lobes anyway, right, during that time. And then we hit age 11, 12, and phase 2 of brain development begins. So what you see is that thickening process, more dendrites, more myelin. The brain decides to prune away cells to make room for those substances. When you get to be about 16 years old, you've got about 45 to 50% of what will be your adult brain. Even at age 20, you've got 80%. Like, we still have a whole fifth of our adult brain that grows and develops over that next 5 years. So really critical part of development based upon a principle known as use it or lose it. Exactly. So basically what your brain does is it senses when there's electrical activity and blood flowing down a pathway of cells. That's the cells that it keeps and makes longer connections for. A pathway that you're not utilizing, there's no electrical activity or blood flow, that's the path that gets pruned away. And so here are the skills that we're growing in our frontal lobes, our prefrontal cortex. So phase 1, phase 2. Phase 1 includes executive functioning skills that are very basic, the foundation of future learning. These are the skills that kind of get us up and get us out the door in the morning, right? We get attention and focus, organization, task initiation. Then when we hit about age 11, 12, phase 2 starts to grow. As those strings of neurons become longer and more complicated, higher level executive functioning skills start to come on board. But unfortunately, this is the phase where a lot of high-risk behavior happens. So we want to talk about and answer this particular question: how do drugs and alcohol and other high-risk behaviors affect the executive functioning skills as we're growing and developing over time? So in order to answer this question, we have to talk about another part of the brain located deep inside, protected by all those fatty myelinated lobes, called the limbic system. This is my favorite picture of it. It's this really cool 3D image of all the little teeny tiny organelles that are inside that govern our fight or flight survival response. Most people know the limbic system for that particular activity that it does. What a lot of people don't realize is that it is also where all pleasurable activities begin and end. Happens in the limbic system, and so that's what we'll focus on, is the pleasure part of it. And in order to discuss that, we have to mention our good old neurotransmitter friend, dopamine. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter of reward. So there's lots of other neurotransmitters that govern mood, things like serotonin or norepinephrine. But if it comes to pleasure and reward, what they're going to all cascade into is an increase or a decrease in dopamine. And so dopamine is the neurotransmitter that makes you feel calm and happy when you do something that's good for your survival. So dopamine actually signals salience. So your limbic system, it's a very unconscious part of our brain. It's not a thinker, it's just a reactor. What it does is it constantly scans the environment outside of your conscious awareness for what's bad for you and what's good for you. Now, when it spots what's good for you, it'll give you a little shot of dopamine to let you know, hey, this is good for your survival. So I'll give you an example of how this happens. What happens to you? How do you feel when you haven't eaten for 4, 5, 6 hours? Angry, hangry, right? Anybody get moody, grumpy, irritable, get tunnel vision, kind of lose your focus? So it's interesting to me because our limbic system, it's not a thinker, right? It's just a reactor. And basically what's happening is your limbic system is depleting itself of dopamine. It's saying, hey, you need to go do something good for my survival. And until you do, I'm going to make you feel really uncomfortable. And then as soon as you eat, you get a 100% increase in dopamine. So your limbic system says, hey, you're going to keep me alive for the next 4 or 5 hours. Here's your reward. Feel calm and happy. Now there's another human behavior we do when we're married and protected, right? Right. Hello. No sex jokes today, huh? Okay, all right. When human beings engage in sexual behavior, we get a dopamine increase of 150%. Scientists believe that this behavior is not only good for our survival, but for our species' survival, so that we get more of a reward. And so, you know, if you think about it, like this is just like a good date night right there, right? Ah, okay, now I get it. So, all joking aside, if somebody snorts a line of cocaine, maybe about this long, they would get a dopamine increase of about 350%. If they use methamphetamine, their dopamine increases by 1100%. Heroin increases dopamine levels by up to 1300%. I can't even put it on this chart because then you wouldn't see food or sex anymore. And that kind of makes sense. If you've ever known anyone who got addicted to heroin or opioids, what's one of the first things they stopped doing? Eating. Having relationships with other people. You guys, the limbic system simply gets hijacked. Remember, it's not a thinker, it's just a reactor. It does this very simple calculation. It says, hey, when you put this in my body, I get 250% more dopamine than when you put this in my body. So that must mean this is 250% better for my survival than this. Simply gets hijacked. Now, our brain has a threshold for pleasure. And here it is. This black line indicates how far our brain is supposed to naturally go up and down with dopamine. Scientists call it the hedonic threshold. Now, we go up and down with dopamine at any given moment of the day. It's just our body's feedback loop, right? It goes down, you get hungry, you eat, it goes back up. Maybe you get bored or lonely, or maybe you feel rejected, you lower dopamine, you call a friend, you go to an activity, go to the gym, work out. There are lots of wonderful things the human body can do to increase dopamine and keep you within this threshold all day. But here is the danger in spiking dopamine levels above our hedonic threshold, is that scientists believe that two things happen. So the first one of those happens within the limbic system, within our very neurons that make dopamine. So this video kind of depicts one of those. What happens is when we put a substance in our body that increases dopamine levels so much, it really literally poops out those neurons. And then they can't make as much dopamine because they've been producing so much dopamine because the chemical tells them, oh, this should increase dopamine levels that much. And so then you have kind of this net decrease in your brain's ability to produce dopamine because those get damaged and pooped out. The second thing that happens is our brain learns. And so with too much dopamine flooding the synapse, all of those long dendrites that have receptor sites on it start growing new receptor sites. And this video illustrates that. As the synapses are flooded with so much dopamine, the brain learns, oh my gosh, I can't handle all this dopamine. I better grow more and more and more receptor sites for dopamine. These are new structural changes that occur deep within the brain. Because they're structural changes, you just can't go unmake them. That is why we have a saying, once an addict, always an addict. Once these new structures are created in your brain, you can't uncreate them. Now, they can become inactive over time if they're not used. And so just like any information, if you don't use it, you have the potential to lose it. And what that looks like is that strings of neurons just atrophy and slough off, the ones that don't get used. That's why sometimes you have to relearn stuff because you didn't use it enough. Same thing can happen with addiction. If you go back to lower levels of baseline while your brain heals, it takes a while, but those brand new receptors can become inactive and if not used, eventually slough off. But in cases of long-term or addiction or substances that spike dopamine levels really high, sometimes it's impossible to lose those at all. So I'll give you an example. So I'm a recovering addict myself. My sobriety date is February 3rd, 89. So next February, I'll have 30 years of sobriety. Wow, isn't that cool? Thank you. Thanks, guys. And so my drug of choice was cocaine, and I did it intravenously. And so I spiked dopamine levels really, really high. And even though it's been almost 30 years since I've put cocaine in my body, it's happening right now. Just talking about it makes my mouth water. And my arms are getting itchy, and I can feel heat on the back of my neck as I start to crave it. So I know that in my brain, I made those structural changes, and that a lot of them are still there. And so if I put too much dopamine back in my body again, all my little receptor sites would do is just pop open again. Those inactive ones, they pop open, and I could return to the same tolerance level that I had 30 years ago in as little as 2 weeks. This is why we have that saying, once an addict, always an addict. So you guys, this is the hedonic threshold for most of us. But about 1 in every 5, 1 in every 6, depending upon the research study, 1 in every 5 or 6 of us has the genetic predisposition for addiction. And what that means is that you actually make, synthesize, store, or process a little bit less dopamine. That means that your dopamine threshold is lower. Maybe it's here. So we know that there is a syndrome that's called reward deficiency syndrome. I read an article that was published in 1996 about RDS. There's a really great article that was published in 2014 about the GARS score, which is your addiction syndrome score. Now we know there are 1,500 genetic polymorphisms that the body may have, and a genetic polymorphism is a gene that just has a little defect in it. Some of those genes, those genetic polymorphisms, show up right away. Sometimes it takes you engaging your environment in a certain way to get that genetic polymorphism to show up. Addiction is that same way. If you don't spike your dopamine levels too high, those genetic polymorphisms stay inactive. Unfortunately, I didn't heed that good advice when I was younger and exposed my body, my brain, and my genes, and so my genetic predisposition kicked in. Now, I just want you to think about this for a second. If genetically you have those polymorphisms, which means your brain makes a little bit less dopamine than everybody else, what does that mean for how you feel on a day-to-day basis? Right? So if you go about your business and you do things that are good for your survival, eating, exercising, having relationships, but yet your body makes a little bit less dopamine, how might you feel? Depressed. A little less calm, right? A little bit more agitated, irritable, restless, discontentedness, and a feeling as if there's something wrong with you that you can't put a finger on it. So I felt that way starting at about age 11. I really felt like genetically something was wrong with me, but I didn't know that it was genetic, so I blamed kind of me as a person. But I remember when I drank alcohol for the first time, that feeling disappeared. So I'll give you another story that really illustrates kind of the difference in this. So she gave me permission to share this story too. So I had a client years ago who saw me do this presentation at her middle school. And so, just by the way, I do this presentation developmentally appropriately from 4th grade all the way up to college. So if you want me to come to your kids' or grandkids' school, let me know. But she walked into my office because she'd been in trouble, so she had to come see me for an assessment. And she walks in and she's like, "Hey, you're the brain lady. You did this great presentation at my middle school a few years ago. I quit smoking pot for like a whole month." So I said, "Great, but what happened?" She said, "Well, you know, my grandparents have custody of me and they don't watch me very well. And my best friend and I, you know, we were hanging out with people who were doing it. And so we created this safety plan." She said, "Check it out. We'd go to the exact same parties always together. And if she drank this much, I would drink this much. If she took one pill, I took one pill. If she smoked, I would smoke." So I'm scratching my head thinking, safety plan? Like, this doesn't sound very safe. But yet she's 16, so she's got about 45–50% frontal lobe, which kind of makes sense. This plan, like 45–50% makes sense, right? So I said, "How's it going?" And she goes, "I'm here, aren't I?" Real snarky. I said, "Touché, all right, what happened?" And she said, "Well, to be really honest with you, my best friend will drink one or two and she'll want to stop. That's crazy to me because it makes me feel so good. I want to keep going." She says, "Sometimes, like, my best friend doesn't want to do it at all because she's gotten sick before. She's like, I never get sick. But what happens to me is that, like, I'll have one or two, and then all of a sudden, I ended up blacking out and having way more than I intended to, and then I'm always the one that gets in trouble." So, y'all, what's my first question for this beautiful young lady?
And your family, too.
Thank you. I'm like, are y'all with me today? Okay. Yes, I asked her, do you have it, genetic history, or does it run in your family, addiction or alcoholism? And she said, "Oh yeah." She said, "My parents both are addicts, which is why I live with my grandparents. They lost custody of me." So it's really interesting because I think about this chart. So for her hedonic threshold is this red line, where it sounds like for her best friend, her hedonic threshold is here. And even though they start spiking dopamine levels the exact same amount, all she has to do is spike to this line and her brain starts making new receptors. Her brain starts making structural changes much sooner than other people. More and more and more receptor sites. And then when all that dopamine leaves the system, all of those new receptor sites, what are they doing? Craving. That is the process of tolerance building and of cravings happening as those structural changes get made. Sometimes they happen slowly, sometimes quickly. Alcohol's between 225 and 250% increase in dopamine levels, depending upon how much you drink in one given moment. Marijuana can spike dopamine levels up to 225, 250, sometimes 275 in some of these newer studies, as that it is being genetically modified to be more and more potent. So it could happen, like I said, quickly or slowly, depending upon what you're using. So you guys, I love this chart. I have it laminated in my office. And the reason is because it can show you, it depicts how anybody can get addicted to anything if they spike dopamine levels above this threshold. Food, sex, pornography, technology. Anybody got a kid that's playing Fortnite right now and you're worried about their brain, right? Anything that spikes dopamine levels above this line has the potential to become addictive. And anything that spikes dopamine levels here can become addictive if you have the genetics. Yes?
Have there been studies yet on gaming and dopamine, like what that would spike to?
So I don't know of any studies that have actually monitored how much dopamine spikes from video games that are published. But video game manufacturers have been hiring addiction scientists for decades. They hook teen testers, they pay them good money, hook teen testers up to machines, brain scans to monitor their sweat response, their heart rate, their dopamine increases, and while they're playing the video game. And then when they see those indicators rise, they record the code that that child just played in the game and report that back to the video game manufacturer that puts more of that code, they call them ludic loop codes, into the game. So they're not going to publish that data, of course, but we know that it spikes dopamine levels high, which is why they're putting more of it into video games. Fortnite is a really beautiful new game, but it is also based upon addiction science studies that show that the sooner you lose or win a game and get to play another one again, the longer you'll play. Just like the concept of binge watching, right? If it just keeps playing for you, you don't have a choice, it keeps going, you'll sit there forever just getting that dopamine spike from it. Okay, so here's what it looks like. This is a functional MRI showing blood flow and electrical activity, and it's a slice of the brain going this way, but we're looking from the top down. And so what you see is a brain of completely sober person on the top, taken 1 second apart. And what you'll notice is that their brain is completely on and working, electrical activity in all lobes and the limbic system all working together, nice and normal. This is a picture of somebody who's been binge drinking. And what you see is that the limbic system is lit up because it's flushed with dopamine. But what you notice is that the frontal lobe goes off. So let me give you a kind of a real life example we can all relate to. Anybody in here overeat on Thanksgiving? Oh, a lot of you guys do. Okay, it's coming up too, right? So what do you feel like doing after you overeat on Thanksgiving? Sleeping? Watching football? Do you feel like doing complex problem solving and decision making? Do you feel like having deep, empathic conversations with somebody? No. And so this is why. This is what your brain looks like on Thanksgiving. Your limbic system is lit up from all that dopamine. Your limbic system says, wow, you're going to keep me alive for the next 8 hours. Here's your reward. Feel calm and happy. And you know what? You don't need the frontal lobe. You don't need to solve problems and make decisions because you're good. You're going to survive for quite a long time. You can shut off. All the blood flow and electrical activity moves into the limbic system to process all that dopamine. Now, this is well and good for us to do this to our brain once in a while, especially if it's already grown and developed. But what if you are in between the ages of 11 and 25 and you're trying to grow your frontal lobe? If it's off, does it get to grow? No, and we call that arrested development. If you start engaging in substance use here and don't stop until you're 20, your brain, if we took a picture of it, wouldn't look like this. It may look more like this. And if you are a regular, everyday or every other day user, it actually may even look like this. And if you keep doing that behavior up until the age of 25, this is where you'll peak. Those executive functioning skills, instead of peaking here, will peak lower. So remember, your processing speed, your IQ, and your executive functioning skills all peak at the age of 25. So if you peak lower, that means your IQ will be less, your executive functioning skills will be less because you'll have shorter neuronal pathways, and your processing speed will be less, which means it'll take you longer to learn because you think slower. And what does that look like as an adult? This is what it looks like. So I was sitting at an addiction conference a few years ago that was put on by a medical association. And I was like, MDs never talk about addiction because they don't get addiction classes in med school. I've asked every single MD or intern I've ever met, how much addiction education did you get? And they all will say, oh, 15 minutes, none, I don't remember. They're really taught to chase and treat symptoms, interestingly enough. So what we see in adults as they grow and develop, if addiction happens quickly or slowly over time, is that somebody can end up looking like this. So I want you guys to remember that the frontal lobe is where all empathy and connection to other human beings is, and animals. If you do a functional MRI while a mother is looking at a picture of her brand new baby, you will see her frontal lobe light up like a Christmas tree. Another study done on devoutly religious people, while they were praying, the frontal lobe lights up. Some beautiful studies done on looking at our pets, our frontal lobe lights up. And so do the pets' frontal lobes. Isn't that cool? Like, we connect that way. So if your frontal lobe is off, you really literally start disconnecting from people. And so, interestingly enough, this can happen quickly, depending upon how quickly somebody gets addicted, or it can happen over decades of time if somebody is a functional alcoholic and their frontal lobe slowly starts to turn off. The good news is that because of the word acquired, you can actually unacquire it. And so if somebody gets sober, it can take time to heal, and I'll show you how long that takes. It takes a while. This is a cocaine abuser's brain, 10 days sober. You can see they're still in detox. That limbic system is screaming for that thing it thinks it needs to survive. And even at 100 days sober, the lights are only about 50% back on here. What I learned is that it takes about a year to a year and a half for this brain to return to normal levels of functioning, but it can. If it's heroin or methamphetamine, it can take up to 5 years. Can you imagine trying to live life on life's terms for 4 to 5 years when your brain's only halfway on? This explains why relapse rates are so incredibly high for those particular drugs. And so it takes time to change. I've been working with a couple right now. They were on the brink of divorce. Now he's getting sober, but she's had a decade of watching her husband move from healthy, connected guy into this. And so I've showed her this picture and she's not quite convinced. At 6 months sober, he's still kind of a jerk sometimes, but a lot of it has to do with it takes a long time to heal that and to change those behaviors.
Do you know the time frame for alcoholics?
That's the time frame. It's a year to a year and a half, right? So we know that relapse rates for average alcoholics at 1 year is 50%. 1 year. When we get to 18 months, it drops down below the 20th percentile. So it's like, we know that's like the magic time for, you want your treatment to be at least 18 months planned, so your relapse rates can drop back down. And the reason is because if we actually took fMRI pictures of them, you'd show the slow progression of moving back to there at about that 18-month mark. Yeah, good question. So we know there's lots of chemicals out there that can spike dopamine levels, but we also know that any behavior that spikes dopamine levels has the potential to also become addictive. And there are a lot of them out there. Actually, do a lit review every year to see the new science. And so if you want me to maybe come back and do a technology presentation, oh my gosh, you guys, it's amazing to see some of the brain studies on how technology is affecting our brain. But we're going to focus on children from here on out. We know that approximately 1 in 4 children in this country are growing up with a parent who is struggling with an addiction. 1 in 4. Quite a lot. This is a picture. I used to work at a wonderful place called the Council on Recovery, and I used to do a camp called Kids Camp. I went to the Betty Ford Institute and got trained in this model. And these are some of the pictures of the kids that the kids drew while they were in the camp. And so what this one is by a 12-year-old girl whose mother didn't think that her alcoholism affected her daughter. But you can see that this kid knew. Every time she sees mom, mom's got a glass of wine. And mom changes quite a lot over 1 day period of time. So we'll talk about the cycle of addiction. Children of alcoholics, we nickname an acronym COA, and adult children of alcoholics are ACOAs. But we know that children of alcoholics are about 4 times likelier than non-COAs to use alcohol or develop alcohol-related problems. And they also initiate alcohol use earlier and engage in problem drinking younger. And a lot of that has to do with what we just talked about, right, is low dopamine levels. But think about it. So they started engaging in that, their frontal lobes are off, and then they become parents. And they're parenting from an acquired narcissistic place because they don't have their entire frontal lobe that's either been developed or is on. So the #1 risk factor for a child being abused is if there's alcoholism or addiction in the home. And children of alcoholics are 4 times more likely to suffer from neglect. We also see the effects of fetal alcohol syndrome. It's not actually called fetal alcohol syndrome anymore. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And these are a few pictures of kiddos that were born with FASD issues. And here are some of the ones that we see actually that can be diagnosed. This is a picture of a child's brain at 6 weeks old, compared to a child's brain at 6 weeks old that was not saturated with alcohol as the mother was growing that baby. And then what we see is the difference in brain structure. The 2 parts of the brain, the corpus callosum and the cerebellum, that are impacted the most when a mother drinks while she's pregnant. These 2 areas that are really very important in communicating motor, sensory, cognitive information, and also processing input from other areas of the brain. The corpus callosum actually helps navigate and connect both parts of the brain together. Now, what I see as a therapist is that there is usually what we call a dysfunctional or an unhealthy family rule, and this is usually it. We don't talk about it, we don't trust, we don't feel, we don't have feelings, we don't deal. I do a lot of work with kids between 7 and 12 years old whose families have alcoholism or drug addiction. Usually they get connected to an ad litem attorney, and then I get referred to do work with that. And it's interesting because what I see is this progression. When they first come see me, of course, they don't want to talk about alcohol at all. And so they may say something like, oh, mom just takes a sleeping pill. She has trouble sleeping. It's amazing the excuses that I've heard kids come up with to describe what they know is not okay, but rationalize or justify, minimize, or excuse it away. And so this is a picture of a kiddo who was about 10, 11 years old. Broken hearts, broken promises, broken bottles equal broken people. And these are some of the things that she heard from her parent who struggled with addiction. So I'll describe the characteristic concerns that we see. These are some things that you actually, if you know of a kid or you have a child in your life who is struggling because they have a loved one who has addiction, that you can actually work on right away. And one of those is that these kiddos feel responsible for their parents' drinking or drug use. You guys know about egocentrism. We think the world revolves around us when we're kids because it does, and it should, right? We should be able to create a world that's pretty awesome that they are the center of, but when bad things happen, that egocentrism causes them to blame themselves. And so what we can do is work on this formula. We can teach them the 7 C's. And this came straight out of Betty Ford treatment program. The 7 C's are: I didn't cause it, I can't control it, I can't cure it, but I can help take care of myself. I can communicate my feelings, I can make healthy choices, and I can celebrate myself. This is a picture of an 8-year-old who talked about how addiction affected her in her life and broke her heart in half. So another characteristic concern is that children fear that the person who uses alcohol or drugs will get sick and die. So this is a couple pictures that illustrate this fear. So, you know, when we're young, we think so concretely. We really don't start thinking abstractly until about age 11, 12, where we can start to see the gray area. And so we need to be able to change this perception that, of course, it could cause death, which is really scary, but we can work on reducing that fear. So children also feel angry with the non-using parent, which is usually the most difficult to work with. It's so interesting to watch kids who have an alcoholic or a drug-addicted parent. They will go to bat for that parent. They attach to that parent in really enmeshed, unhealthy ways. And when the other non-using parent confronts this parent, they have to go through their kids sometimes. And so when the non-using parent takes an action against that other parent by potentially suing for custody or removing that child from the home, you may see a big struggle with attachment issues because those kids may be very, very angry at the non-using parent for those behaviors, not quite understanding that they're keeping them safe. So this is a picture of a kid who feels just tons of anger about this. Not only did she have to leave her dad, but now she's in a new home with new circumstances and she misses all of her old friends and sense of safety. Another picture that really kind of depicts the tears, the lies, the no fun that comes once recovery starts, unfortunately. So another concern is that children are embarrassed by their parents' behavior. This is a picture that was done of a kid who the parent had an alcohol incident and the police and the ambulance and the fire truck came, and you can see how scary that was and how well preserved in memory it is for that young one. Another concern is that children really never know what to expect from a parent who's using. Addiction, how it's hurting my family. You can see they're passed out. And she's crying, she doesn't know. I've had so many kids tell me that their moms or dads forgot to give them dinner. They didn't eat for a few meals in a row, sometimes days. They get dropped off at school late or sometimes not at all because mom or dad's got a hangover. Or they have to experience going to visit their parent in jail if something happens. Children are confused by the difference between dry and drunk behavior. So it's interesting because even if mom or dad gets sober, a lot of times they're off going to recovery meetings and they forget promises. And so they're not quite sure if getting sober or not drinking is a good idea. And sometimes they want their parent to use again because they were much more fun when they were drinking or using, that they were just really not emotionally present. And now that they're sober, they're criticizing and controlling in ways they hadn't before. So let's talk about preventative factors and we'll wrap it up. So we know, sure.
What happens with families where there's autistic children?
What happens in families where there are autistic children in addition to alcohol and drug use? Well, so as we know that there are certain kiddos and certain populations that need more attention on a daily basis. And so the same thing, but the effect is greater, right, on a child who needs more attention. And also there are some kiddos that have even greater difficulty of processing what's going on. And so what's going on with them may get worse or just not get treated at all. It's a good question. Yes?
Is
there a difference if the father is alcoholic and the mother isn't? Is there a difference in the baby?
That's a great question. Is there a gender difference? And so in my years of doing this, which is about almost 25 now, I don't see much of a difference because of gender issues. What I do see is if there was a difference in attachment early on. So if a child is less attached to dad before the alcoholism hits, then it has less of an impact. So it really has a lot to do with how well attached we were in the beginning. Okay. I hate to say that because it's almost like they fare better if they were less attached, but being less attached actually sets you up for a lot of problems that are negative in life to begin with, right? So it's really not better. It's a longer continuum of issues, definitely. Okay, so family dinners. This is pretty critical science. They've tracked this over decades of research, and they found that as family dinners decrease, high-risk behavior increases. So something simple that you can do to prevent substance use in kids is actually increase or maintain the amount of family dinners that you have. So if you're a therapist or a social worker, that's something that you can include in your treatment plans right away, is getting parents and families connected and maintaining these family dinner times. Because at family dinners, we look each other in the eye, we get dopamine from being united as a family, and we get to talk about our rules and our family code. So that's another prevention technique that you can use, is you can create family codes when we're young. So the Collier family code is, in our family, we treat others with kindness, compassion, and respect. We don't use drugs ever, and only alcohol when we're 21. That's the family code. It is written, and it's somewhere in the house. I remember I had a dad who created a family crest and printed this out. I had a family create a poster board with a tree on it with their code, and they put it up someplace in the house. And then once in a while, you reference the family code, especially when they're maybe going to go out to a high-risk situation, like, for instance, a sleepover. I can't tell you how many exposures to drugs and alcohol and other high-risk addictive behaviors happen at sleepovers, because you don't know what the family's code is that you're sending a kid to, even if you know that family. So as the child's walking out of the house, you remember the family code in our family: no drug, no high-risk behavior, technology, 1 hour a day, right? Once in a while, you get to reinforce that, and you can talk about it and help create it at family dinners. So this is such an interesting picture. This actually came from Betty Ford, and you can see what the most prominent family member in this picture is. It's the beer bottle. And what do you see the parents in this picture doing? Running toward it. And what's happening to the kids? They're just like neglected. Her poor little pigtails are even sad. So some common beliefs in families with addiction: don't rock the boat, do as I say, not as I do. It's not okay to be playful, to talk about your feelings, express yourself. So some educational challenges that we see is that kids who grow up in alcoholic systems or drug-addicted systems may have more learning disabilities. They may repeat more grades, attend more schools on average because of the instability. And we also see that children of alcoholics tend to have higher levels of acting out behavior. And important for kids to hear: you're not alone. You are not responsible. It is not your fault for what's happening in your family. You can't control your parents' use. Things can be better for you. There are people and places that can help you. I might be a person that you can talk to about this. And all of your feelings are okay. So a few of the texts that we recommend for this, to understand how addiction is seen through a child's eyes, how addiction impacts divorce, and then one of my favorite ones, How to Raise a Drug-Free Kid. There's actually a second edition of this that actually highlights my prevention program that I created. But I have to say, buy the first edition because it's kind of better. even though, to be honest. But this is really great because it gives you scripts too on how to talk to young people too about it, how to reduce that behavior. And of course, if you would like my presentation, you're more than welcome to. And my shameless plug for myself is one of the reasons I was awarded a fellowship here at Hope and Healing was to write this book. It's called the Whereabouts Book. It's a neurodevelopmental guide to help parents prevent high-risk behavior, and it will be published in 2019. So if you'd like to receive an email when it comes out, please feel free to go to the website and put your name on my blast list, and I'll send you one email and one email only the day that it's published so that you know. But I believe that it's important to not only know where your children are in the universe physically, but also where their brain development is, what high-risk behavior pop up at different ages, and what prevention science says that you can do to prevent those things at home.